The voyage of the MS Swabenland to Antarctica in 1938 to 1939 has gained quite the notoriety, as it is the basis of many conspiracy theories about hidden German bases in Antarctica. This video will not be covering these, however, but only the known expedition and the ship the Swabenland itself, as well as the region named after it. Much of the mystery surrounding the Third German Antarctic expedition comes from the fact that the government of the Third Reich managed to keep it secret, so it was only announced at the end of the expedition, and the war put an end to any actual German claim to parts of Antarctica. First, let's look into some reasoning for the expedition. It was not a purely research expedition. At the time, whale oil and fats were very important for the production of soap, industrial oils and dietary fats. Germany had a large import of whale oil from Norway.
Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Guten Tag. This is Professor Hamamoto with you on Easter Sunday, April 20th, year 2022 at 4:01 p.m. PDT. And I began with a cold opening of a short documentary in English, but produced in Germany about some of the early years of what today is known as Neue Schwabenland. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a conspiracy any longer. Today, I will be surveying a lot of different materials, and there's far more than I'm ever able to really cover here in 60 minutes or so. And as I saw Corky Goss comment early on, he watched a lot of shows, TV shows, presumably, featuring pop Nazis. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, it seems to grow in popularity with each passing year. And I'll talk about that. In fact, I'll lead with the mysterious death, murder of one Bob Crane, the actor. He played Hogan, Captain Hogan in Hogan's Heroes. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the evolution of that particular show. I learned something quite fascinating about how a program about Nazi concentration camps, or more accurately, POW camps, prisoner of war camps, how it would appear on a primetime network. But we'll get into that in a moment. I'll also talk about certain films by now have entered into the collective unconscious or perhaps conscious mind, cited or alluded to over and over again. Films like Boys from Brazil, which many of you know was a cinema adaptation of a horror, I guess you could call it, book by the author Ira Levin. This is the same Ira Levin who wrote Rosemary's Baby, Westworld, and a number of books that were eerily prescient, as it turns out. Why is that? I can't tell you, because I've been looking fairly systematically for background information on Ira Levin, but I've only begun to scratch the surface. And the same is true for certain other types of authors that seem to have a foreknowledge of what's going down or what has transpired. For example, I gave a talk on Michael Crichton. There's a little bit more information about him, but not as much that would satisfy a critical mind like you and I have, right? Another person of interest is the author, let's see, what's his name? Not David. We're going to talk about David Irving in a little while, but gosh, his name slips from my mind for now. But he's also, I know, Thomas Harris. That's right. How can I forget? I tried to find as much as I could about the person who did the Hannibal Lecter trilogy or quadrilogy, of course, later made 2 films. He doesn't give interviews. There's not a lot written about him either. He's another, and I'm telling you this for if you're interested in researching this. This is an area that I think will bear quite interesting and juicy fruit if we begin to look. So, probe as we are into the recesses of a war that for many Americans, even though those of us who were born in the years after World War II, still remains strong, salient, not just in the popular imagination, but in our political life. I mean, how often do you hear some critic or even a demagogue talk about, oh, we're in the Fourth Reich here? Usually it's applied to America. Usually it's a Western European country. Oh, Britain's turning into the Fourth Reich, or Germany's returning to the Fourth. On and it's become a rhetorical trope, right? And perhaps there's an element of truth in it. I'm not going to dispute it. I'm just saying that it just rolls off our tongue so easily in trying to understand these complex historical realities. And as per cultural forensics theory and method, I always look at the popular culture to really gain access to what I've already alluded to as the collective unconscious. At least the media has become the collective conscious or unconscious of most people, unless you're not living on the grid. You're not going to know who Hogan's Heroes are, the boys from Brazil, or let's see, Steven Spielberg's film, right? The search for lost Nazi treasure, right? It goes on and on. And these are just fictional works, not to mention the tons of books, and we'll mention a couple authors here today, tons of books in the nonfiction realm that write about the Third Reich and the Fourth Reich. Fourth Reich, that's the title of a book by, remember Jim Marrs? The late, great Jim Marrs. He wrote a book called The Fourth Reich. He is referencing the United States of America. Check the book out. It has a very important function for people who are still living in la la land, so far as that understanding of deep American history is concerned. But for today's purposes, I have drawn inspiration from at least two books. I've put links to them on the description here if you want to buy the books. This one I can recommend. It's called Fourth Reich. Again, but the difference between this and Jim Marrs's book is that this is a academically certified piece of scholarship. It's published by Cambridge University Press. All right, so it must have some sort of, according to the people who reviewed and edited and published this book, it must have some sort of scholarly place in the discussion here. All right, so we don't have to jump over that particular, you're publishing with so and so or so and so, we can't take you seriously. Well, this is Cambridge University Press, but this scholar here, his name's Gavriel, G-A-V, not B, G-A-V-D Rosenfeld. He's an academic here in the U.S. This is an award-winning book as well, for if that impresses you. But I was particularly, and it's a long and extensive and really, really deep book. And I don't mean to give it short shrift here, but what really caught my attention for today's topic is this entire section he wrote within a chapter on what I'm calling pop Nazism. That's not his term. This is a concept that I kind of threw out there. I hope you're not offended by it. Nazism is real. It's a historical reality. Its elements are still with us in 2025, as we'll talk about presently. But anyway, Professor Rosenfeld has a whole section here. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Fourth Reich, subtitled Popular and Critical Reception. And he talks in a subsection titled Popular Reception. He talks about best-selling books, just a few for you here. The Quiller Memorandum, which I confess to have not read. The Odessa File, which I have read, and maybe I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment. The Wind Chill Factor, I have not read that. Sorry. The Boys from Brazil, I've already spoken of that. That's required reading. I think most of you probably read it anyway. But if you want to continue your study of Ira Creepy Levin and try to understand what he was doing, I think it was part of a psyops, but I'm just speculating at this point, then you definitely have to read Boys from Brazil and watch the film version of it, starring two heavyweights of world cinema, Laurence Olivier, Sir Laurence Olivier, and Gregory Peck. Right. And they teamed up together there. Of course, they're on the opposite ends of the political and ideological fence, but it's a very, very well done film, if I may say so. There's the Valhalla Exchange, which I think was made into this is kind of dim. I haven't read that one. And finally, there's more, but we'll stop here. The Hallcroft Covenant, which I have read, and it's also an excellent film adaptation starring Michael Caine. Oh, yes. Right. These are some serious movies with some big time stars, which tells us that there are forces behind the scenes who are financing these cultural productions because they want the public to see these stories and absorb the themes for reasons that we'll talk about in a moment. And you'll have your own guesses as to why the environment is being conditioned by evil pop Nazis. Right. We'll get to that in a moment, Be patient. There's something for everybody here. This is like the Ed Sullivan Show. For the younger people, what? The Ed Sullivan Show? Yeah, it's a variety show, right? One act doesn't have any relationship to the following act. You can have people spinning the plates, right? Topo Gigio, and the next act is the Beatles, right? There's no rhyme. It's the old-fashioned variety show. That's what you're going to get here today. All right, so that's popular fiction. For those of us who are of a certain age, we certainly remember The Man from U.N.C.L.E., a very popular television show when it was more than a fad. It was an engineered focus on spy material on network television because the James Bond, what they call now a franchise, was already demonstrating its commercial popularity. Produced by Albert Broccoli. He's a person who deserves a talk unto himself. How did he buy these properties from the Fleming estate? How did he negotiate that? See, I'm always interested in the people who are behind the scenes or on the periphery, right? Yeah, Michael Caine's really interesting. There's tons of books. He's written a couple books himself about his own career. We can do that, but what really takes the discussion forward are these people like Al Ruddy, who we'll get to in a moment, or Cubby, or better known formally as Albert Broccoli. I think his family still owns the estate there, but this is something that we need to examine in the future. So we have The Man from U.N.C.L.E. By the way, I'm sorry to digress, but can't help myself. The star, or one of the co-stars of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. series, which I personally enjoyed the heck out of it, his name's Robert Vaughn. And only recently did I find out that Robert Vaughn, who was a serious actor, right? These are not contradictions in terms of serious acting. I know we're caught up in the age of celebrity, but there are some actors who are serious intellectuals. They're thinking people like Randy Quaid, for example. It's a thinking person. Gene Hackman was a thinking person. So don't get them confused with the celeb actors, all right? But anyway, Robert Vaughn went on to get a PhD at the University of Southern California, and he wrote a dissertation on the American blacklist. I have a copy of it. Maybe I should give a talk on that. That's Robert Vaughn. So I discovered something fascinating, the connection there. Then there's Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which probably had a couple of pop Nazi figure, or plots built around Mission Impossible. That one's easy to see. Mannix, The New Avengers, Wonder Woman, the original one with Linda Carter, and The Great American Hero. And there's tons of other series that have featured Nazi plots or subplots, right? So the point is that yes, indeed, there's something called pop Nazism. All right. Excuse me if I use the term in sort of a cutesy fashion, but this is what I'm trying to communicate. It's entered into the popular consciousness via these media products. And remember, and I touched upon this briefly, all too briefly, in yesterday's marvelous conversation I had with the one and only Sean Atwood. I talked about CBS Sony Records in conjunction with the legal problems, shall we say delicately, being experienced by one Sean Combs. I failed to remind the audience that CBS is a Japanese-owned company. The lion's share of the profits are going overseas, and they're entering the Tokyo as well as the New York Stock Exchange. So there are yellow people at the top of the pyramid. All right, that's all, which causes me to wonder even more, why aren't there more yellow people in movies? Now, I'm not talking just about in front of the camera, but in the executive suite, right? This is something that I made into a lifelong pursuit in the academic level of bringing equity so far as that concerned. So Mr. Sony over there in, I don't know where your headquarters are, but they're probably Tokyo. In fact, I think I've been by the Sony world headquarters building. You need to go into the US and capture that market, right? Because there are millions, tens of millions of people who speak different Asian languages and who are yellow people who are being underserved by the movie business. Blacks, yes, they're being overserved, overrepresented, because I guess they're much more of a threat than we obedient yellow people. Latinos, to a certain extent, yeah, you got your Jezebel Lopez that Andrade, and before that there was Selena, right? But it's still relatively, and perhaps Tommy Mottola can take a little credit for bringing Latin music more into the mainstream with the Miami Sound Machine. But it's still, relatively speaking, an underdeveloped market. So anyway, I'm getting off track slightly here, but this is all to say that if you want to explore further, look at this biography of one William S. Paley, which I talked about in the Sean Atwood show. Now, here's a man full of internal contradictions. His parents were Jews from Central Europe. They were immigrants. Right? His father became a fairly prosperous businessman. He was in the cigar trade, right? And William Paley was being groomed to enter that business, but he had larger plans. And also, and this book doesn't cover it, this is going to require further research. He got a hookup with the U.S. government, the U.S. military. And that's how he was able to grow one of the three monopolies in the television, radio, and of course, recorded music business. ABC, CBS, and NBC. Those were the big three when people of my generation were growing up. There weren't any other choices. It was three networks. And I'm telling you this, especially for younger people, it's hard to fathom that there were such limited choices. Of course, there were the local stations. We had here in LA, it was KTLA or KCOP. There were Channel 5, Channel 9, and Channel 13. These were all local stations, but the affiliates were all owned and operated by the networks in New York City. That's probably more than you want to know. But the point I'm making is that William Paley himself, who was a Jew, who was part of the, not part of, he was instrumental into the U.S. Army psychological operations during World War II, right? Along with other media persons whose empires exploded in the post-war period during the civilian reconstruction of the American economic juggernaut, right? The networks, advertising, the magazines, they all grew. This is the golden age of America that Donald Trump is trying to bring back, right? This is Make America Great Again. What was the again he's referring to? He's talking about the 1950s through a greater part of the 1960s. But part of it was not only economic production, but production in the area of behavioral and thought control, courtesy of the networks. So here was Colonel William, I think his rank was Colonel. Here was Colonel William Paley on site with the U.S. military during the liberation of Dachau, right? He saw firsthand the squalor, the misery, the incredible evil that had been allowed to metastasize over the years, over the decades, with, and you know this already, with the cooperation of the so-called allies, including American corporations and Wall Street. You know that already. My job is getting easier all the time. There's less and less backstory I have to provide because most of you know this by now. There's been an explosion in so-called conspiracy theory. I call it New World Order theory. And I've been teaching it in the academic world as my front and center theory and methodological approach since 2004, right? Not Marxism, not feminism, not racial critical race studies, none of that. I grew out of it. Right? I just saw them as arms as part of a larger octopus that I call New World Order control. So I had come up with my own New World Order theory. So here was a gentleman, William Payne, fabulously rich, of course. And according to this book, he had a problem with his Jewish identity, which seems to be common for the second generation. They're kind of embarrassed of their parents because they speak English with an accent, or maybe they're Orthodox and they've got big hairy beards and they're wearing a hat and the mother's wearing a wig. So they're embarrassed because they just want to go out in the street and play with the boys, play baseball, go see the Yankees, and just go to the nightclubs and listen to some jazz, do some smoking and drinking and whatever else that young people are supposed to be doing, right? So he always tried to live like a Anglo WASP, I should say more specifically, a WASP high-born gentleman. He married in that direction, and those were his social connections. So he had this kind of conflict here. And this is what I'm talking about when I allude to anxiety, right? And it showed up in the shows because this same gentleman who saw the liberation of Dachau, who had been part of war planning and execution through its psychological operation, and in the post-war period, he was doing the psyops on me and all the other baby boomers without us knowing it. Here's a guy that by 1965 put on a show that was a television sitcom that was set in a Nazi or a prisoner of war camp run by the Wehrmacht. They might not have been Nazis. I don't know. Right? Most Germans, for your information, were not Nazis. Right? So I'll call them Wehrmacht because most of the enlisted people were soldiers doing their duty to the Vaterland. So you have these, and before this, keep in mind, if you want to look at some of the older movies, the Nazis were just these cartoon characters, the embodiment of evil. But in 1965, and I was a kid, all of a sudden that image had reversed itself, and they were just kind of funny, happy-go-lucky, highly incompetent, easy to deceive officers like Sergeant Schultz, right? Played by John Banner. Or Colonel Schlink. He was the commandant of the Gulag, played by Werner Klemperer. an excellent. All the actors were incredibly good. It's too bad they had to play such really crappy type roles. But acting is acting, whatever. And then, of course, many of you know Bob Crane himself met a weird, bizarre, still unsolved, I believe, murder because he was involved. There was a book, I think it was written by his own son. He was involved in all kinds of sexual voyeuristic kink. He would, in those days, these video cameras were new and you had to be connected and have lots of money to be able to carry one around. And he did that with his buddies, and they would meet women and film sex. And I don't know what they did with the movies. Gosh, who knows? There needs to be some more research on it. Maybe he has sidelined doing blackmail operations for Mossad. I don't know. I don't think he was doing it for his own kinky enjoyment, though. He wound up dead. How did he wind up dead? Okay, story upon story upon story. Let's take a look. For younger people, you might not know what I'm talking about. So let's just take a quick look at who Robert Crane was, or Bob Crane.
Well-known character Colonel Hogan always got one over on the bad guys, but Crane's real-life luck ran out when he was murdered in his bed, with his killer never brought to justice. When the series Hogan's Heroes debuted on CBS in 1965, it made actor Bob Crane an overnight star. Crane rose to fame relatively quickly, following a semi-regular role on The Donna Reed Show and guest appearances in The Alfred Hitchcock Hour and The Dick Van Dyke Show. Hogan's Heroes was the break Crane needed to vault him to success. The series centered around the captives of a German POW camp during World War II, who were helping prisoners from other camps and various other enemies of Nazi Germany escape through a network of tunnels. It's all done, of course, without the knowledge of the inept and comically bumbling Nazi camp leadership.
Hogan, just because you're wearing my uniform doesn't mean that you're me.
Good. I was afraid this uniform might be contagious.
The show ran for 168 episodes, concluding in 1971. From there, Crane played roles in a variety of films over the following years, along with guest spots on popular network TV shows. He also had his own series, The Bob Crane Show, which ran for 14 episodes in 1975. It could be argued that the only thing Crane is more known for than his portrayal of Colonel Hogan is his unsolved murder. In the early summer of 1978, Crane was viciously attacked in a rented apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, despite there
All right, I'll leave that for you to follow up on it if you're interested in reading more about the Bob Crane death. I think there was a film or a biopic made about the Bob Crane story starring Greg Kinnear. And the only reason I remember Greg Kinnear as an actor is because he had his own talk show before he went into acting. And my silent advice was, don't quit your day job, because I think he seems to, Greg Kinnear seems to have sunk without a trace. Now, I can think of no more narcissistic an act than to read from my own work. But I just want to demonstrate to you that I didn't just start this as a hobby, right? There's many people in the academic world, they may teach history and sociology or psychology or some legitimate academic scholarly pursuit, and then they have what's called a hobby. They'll teach a little film class on the side or something about rock musicals, just kind of to break up the monotony of their dreary scholarship. But that's not me. I just went right to it. And I'm telling you this because I still harbor a great deal of resentment for the resistance and opposition and the mockery. The mockery I can deal with, but the exclusion for someone who said, no, we need to really study this important medium of the 20th century, the mid-20th century, called television. So I wrote a book on a sitcom. It's called Nervous Laughter. You've heard me say it before. And again, I don't want to indulge myself by reading my own prophetic, incisive work from 1989. I'm not a newbie. Okay, I don't have a staff of people like these people that have millions of subscribers. And by the way, please subscribe here, because I want to compete with Ian Carroll, who comes out of nowhere. Sus. I want to compete with Candace Owens, who comes out of nowhere. sus. But anyway, I have a whole section here on Hogan's Hero, and I'm not approving of it at all. How can someone like William Paley, how can a whole generation of men, most of them who'd been in the military and had seen and known and learned about the atrocity, how can they put such material on television for us little kids who were too young to be part of the war and to shape our whole perceptions like that? The only possibility that I can come up with, you can have your own suggestions, put them down here in the box, in the comment section, is that the United States was trying to rehabilitate its Cold War ally, now West Germany, against the Soviet bloc, the Soviet juggernaut. So out went the bad Nazis, in came the friendly joker or jokey Nazis, right? There must be some very important power politics that we don't know about yet that went into this high-level corporate decision to put Hogan's Hero on the air. And I'm sure a similar discussion was taking place in the publishing business, also in New York City, where the networks are all headquartered, right? All that needed to be done is someone from DC to fly down there and say, okay, these are going to be the books and the plots of the next few years as we further isolate the Soviet Union, or as we go into Taiwan or wherever it might be, geopolitical strategies. And this is all going to go into television and radio and movies by extension and books. Right? This is all Cold War propaganda in the broadest sense of the word. All right, we'll get back to it. So that's William Paley. And I think by now I have a better idea why he would sell out in such a fashion. But anyway, this is a discussion that we can continue into the future. But before I go on, this is another book that helped to inform today's discussion. This one, I think, between the Fourth Reich, as good as it is, this is more of an academic book, okay, like Cambridge University. This is more for the general reader, and I would suggest buying this book before any others if you're interested in the topic. Even if you're not interested in the topic, you will become obsessed with the topic of Neue Schwabenland, of the Fourth Reich, and how it connects to the release of the JFK-RFK assassination papers. Because there's a lot of Third Reich secrets that were kept away from us until very recently. You're going to have to know how to read against the grain to get maximum effect from this material that you've been crying out for decades now. But you don't know what you're looking at unless you have some sort of historical knowledge. So toward that end, pick up this book. It's called The Last 20 Years of Hitler in Argentina and His Visitors from 1945 to 1965. And it's by one of my favorite authors. I don't know if this is a pseudonym. There's another guy who's kind of a mystery. I want to know more about him or her. I don't know. I read a lot of his other books under this name. Maximilien de Lafayette. That's a mouthful. If you're watching, Monsieur Lafayette, please get in touch with me. I'll have you on the show here. Right. We've got a lot to talk about. But independently of that, I've been trying to locate where can I find him. I would like to have him on for discussion. But anyway, back to the book. There's incredible photos, many of which I've never seen, right? For that alone, this is worth the price of admission. Not that I'm an expert on this field, but I've seen the same photos as you have, the group photo of the paperclip scientists, and there's Werner von Braun there, and the usual suspects, and other characters, right? But this has something for everybody, just briefly. There's a picture of my former colleague at the University of California, Davis, Dr. Edward Teller, right here. He's testifying. He's probably in the process of ratting out Robert Oppenheimer. And in fact, right below him is Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the great haunted genius of the University of California. Right. But there's also photos, and this is in some of the other Lafayette books, which I'd never seen. He did a couple books or one or two books on Maria Orsic. Very little written about her. Some people are still wondering if she was truly a historical personage or some sort of composite or a piece of fiction. Maria Orsic, the beautiful long-haired Aryan goddess who just disappeared as the Third Reich was falling. Where did she disappear to? Could it have been Neue Schwabenland or perhaps Bariloche, Argentina? But anyway, some photos of the Horton brothers who made all these futuristic spacecraft. I mean, the B-1 bomber is modeled after all these advanced aeronautics. And then that there's serious discussion about where this technology came from outside of planet Earth. Was this because of some sort of off-planet technology that was being adapted for terrestrial use? Were they even human creatures who passed on this information? So on and on it goes. You can see why this whole discussion is easily shelved into the area of quote unquote conspiracy theory. But what if only a smidgen of this is historically and politically true? Don't you think it's worth our while and the interest of government intelligence, as well as the military branches and people in general, to know the deeper secrets of the Fourth Reich? And why are they putting up these films and these books and these records and creating these synthetic fascistic organizations to keep alive this notion of the Fourth Reich coming back, this time with more of a vengeance motive behind it? Right. And I'm alluding to the fact that a lot of these so-called white supremacist neo-Nazi groups are what? They're not organic. Guess what? They're created by the people that William Paley worked with. These are called psychological operations. And do we want our behavior, our political decisions, do we want our lives being mapped out by all these scenarios created by crazed but well-paid morons who instruct the media organizations what memes, what themes, what topics are going to be covered and how they are going to be doled out to the public? Right. Such as and I saw it recently, the film The Darkest Mind. It's all about children power, especially girl power, is being pushed right now. And they even hired a yellow woman to direct the second film of this book series that was published in order to get into that teen youth market that they're trying to do. They, being the handlers, are trying to develop as a block against the adult population and other groups. There's always different groups that are targeted, they're selected and targeted, that are being used as offensive weapons by the mind managers. William Paley is emblematic of this decades-long process. All right. So in understanding or looking more deeply into this dark history, hopefully we can avoid the fate of previous populations that fell for the ministry of propaganda, right, as headed by one Elman Gilbers. Right. Another piece of information that crossed my desk in preparation for this talk was that one of the co-creators of Hogan's Heroes, was a guy named Al Ruddy. And that set off an alarm bell. And I said, Al Ruddy, wasn't he the producer of The Godfather? Directed by Francis Ford Coppola? Because I've studied that text very, very closely. Indeed, I recently got a really handsome book called The Notebooks of Francis Ford Coppola about The Godfather. They gathered his papers and bound it into a nice cloth edition. And I didn't realize that it was autographed, so I haven't even opened it. It's encased in shrink-wrapped plastic. I haven't dared open it up yet. I'm approaching it like a sacred icon. Anyway, the point is that film has been studied meticulously by scholars and the general public as well. And Al Ruddy was the person who pushed through this plagued film. It was plagued by a lot of internal creative financing issues. The parent company was Paramount, which was a Gulf and Western company. It's talk about globalism and film coming together, right? And there were casting decisions. Everybody knows the story about how the higher ups didn't want Francis Ford Coppola to use Al Pacino, and he almost got fired several times. He had to protect him, right? But through all that, there was a guy who was a fixer. And I gave a talk several weeks ago about Hollywood fixers. Al Ruddy comes right out of the old school of Hollywood fixers. And there's new school ones right now in 2025. And these are the people right now who are working behind the scenes outside the Southern District Court in New York City, outside of the trial that's pending of Sean Combs, who are trying to fix the situation. And these same individual, not the same ones, but these fixers are also working behind the scenes to spring Harvey Weinstein. Now, we're talking about the real justice system, not the theatrical one, right? As important as I don't need to be dismissive of it, I'm just saying we need to look at the larger scenario so that we stop being taken by surprise and perennial disappointed and demoralized by decisions that baffle us, right? So Al Ruddy is an old-time fixer, and there was some problems on the set because it was being filmed in New York. Francis Ford Coppola wanted to have the reality. He wanted to film the streets of New York. There's no place on earth like it. They can't do it in Toronto. Today, in 2025, many so-called New York films are made in Toronto, and I can tell they're phony. The light's different. For one thing, the lighting scheme's different, and they're doing it primarily for tax and investment purposes. The government of Canada is subsidizing these. They're paying them off, these film production companies, so that they'll take American jobs overseas, right? Where's your tariffs there, Mr. President? The runaway productions of Hollywood American movies. And as I've alluded to before, a lot of what we think are American movies are actually made in the United Kingdom. Barbie, for example, right? Greta Gerwig lives most of the time in London, hanging out with the MK Ultra people over there. The MI people figuring out what new movies are they going to fabricate for the American audience. That's where the financing is. City of London. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. At least in the old days, William Paley was an American nationalist. He was making film, television, and music for American people. Right? The stuff that we're seeing now is made for globalists, by globalists. All right, so Al Ruddy, getting back to him, he was an old-fashioned mensch. He was not an accountant. He didn't go to business school at Harvard or the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a mensch. He was a Canadian national. He was maybe binational, I don't know. But he was a mensch. He went to go sit down with one of the top figures. There's 5 families by consensus of the American mafia, right? And one of them was Joe Colombo. And at the time he ran that part of New York City, he said, there's going to be no filming here unless we get our piece. In addition to that, we as Italian Americans, Sicilian Americans, we are tired of being denigrated by Hollywood. We are not all gangsters. Many of us are, sure, but most of us are legitimate, just like all Germans are not Nazis. And he even started a civil rights movement to following Black people and Latinos. And by the way, there was a yellow civil rights movement that you'll never hear about, because the yellow people can afford to disregard the obedient, non-squeaking wheels who work for the machine quietly. But Joseph Colombo started the Italian American Civil Rights Organization, and you know how that ended up, right? He got a bullet in his head. He was shot right in public. Right, there's a whole story about that. You can watch the Michael Francis channel, really excellent show. He was a MAID member, as you know, and he happened to be there, right, sharing the stage with Joe Colombo right moments before he was shot in the head by an assassin. Of course, they put the gun in a Black man's hand, right? What was that guy thinking? Did he think he was going to get away with it? But anyway, Al Ruddy had to go in there to say, listen, here's the script. We want to be as respectful as possible to the Italian American community and the great contributions they made to the society, the culture, the economy. And we're going to do this, this, and this. We're going to have films of family, weddings, celebration, christenings. We're going to give the full three-dimensional scope of Italian American life. And Joe Colombo was won over by that discussion. Plus, I think he probably took some good faith money, shall we call it, in exchange. So the filming went on. So this character, Al Ruddy, we need to know more about him. Fortunately, some documentarians have him on. He himself could have been an actor in The Godfather, right? He was right out of Central Casting, super gangster. He is a mensch, all right? In the previous talk, I said I grew up wanting to be a Jewish intellectual or a Jewish comedian. I was almost going to change my name to Shlomo, right, toward that end. But I admitted the third one. I also wanted to be a Jewish gangster because I was influenced as a youth by Mickey Cohen, who I met as a kid in Los Angeles. My dad introduced me to him. So I was on my way. So that's where I'm coming from when I'm looking at these characters. You understand that? I don't really have a moralistic beef against these characters who are operating in the gray zone, because you know what? That's how real life operates. I hate to burst your bubble. If you're over a certain age and you still think, if you still believe that there's a certain set of rules and norms that the big boys and the big girls, like the Clintons and the Uma Abedin and your Letitia James, that they follow those rules and they're supposed to be held to it, then you're living in delusion land. So be a wise guy or a wise gal, whatever it is. So here's Al Ruddy. So Al Ruddy is alluding to his previous distinction of having produced The Godfather, a classic and not just American, but world cinema. So that's my fantasy. I would like to get all the gangster money from the Asian world, Sony and Chicom money, and be producer of all these different television, movies, new media, streaming, animation, recording for the yellow world, so that one day I will be able to ascend the stage at the Academy of Arts and Sciences and receive my trophy for service to America. All right. Laugh on. It always begins in his fantasy, right? All right. So let's turn to the film I alluded to at the top of this talk, The Boys from Brazil. Let's look at the trailer. Now, I might get a copyright strike on this. For those of you who are watching this after the live stream, you might see a little black blank there because I had to take it out. But for the live stream people, you're able to see a revisit. It's an excellent film. I would recommend going to your local retailer and ordering it and watching it and studying it. The Boys from Brazil. Here we are.
History has shown how one man with a dream can turn the world into a nightmare. Can history repeat itself? The Boys from Brazil starts where that nightmare left off. But for the dream to live again, 94 men must die. Gregory Peck is the architect of that dream. Laurence Olivier is the man who must destroy it before it destroys the world.
He betrayed you! He betrayed the Aryan race!
We cannot tell you who the Boys from Brazil are, only that they are not science fiction.
30 years the world has forgotten, and you persist and persist.
Will not take guards now, madame. You are prisoner.
The time is the present. The people exist. The threat is real.
Your operation has been cancelled. No. Your operation has been cancelled. Mine continues. Barry is dead. Herr Liebermann.
Only you can decide if it's a dream or a nightmare. But be warned, if history can repeat itself, so can man.
A total of 94 assassinations.
Look for the Boys from Brazil before they look for you.
And how can we forget the great James Mason? Yes, he plays a prominent role. That there's a whole cloning subtext that runs through it too. And this film was what, 1977, something like this, right? Ira Levin was up there so far as being an insider to certain types of developments, technology that was that found their way into his books, and by extension into the movie. So that's worth checking out. Okay, this is back in the 1970s. I think his publishing career I'd say, started in the 1980s, but certainly through the 90s and the thousands, the name David Irving came to international prominence. And I'm mentioning him here is because there has been a systematic attempt to erase his memory and his books from public awareness. And he is one of the more important historians of the 20th century and going into the 21st century. David Irving, get your pencil out, write it on the pad. I was checking it out. He has his own website. You can buy his books there. And I'm telling you this because you can't find them on Amazon. If you do, they cost hundreds of dollars. And as I was researching David Irving many, many years ago, I started buying his books. And now they're worth a small fortune, but because he wants the information out, he's reissuing, I think, almost all of his work. They're David Irving. So I encourage you to at least explore the website. And I'll show you in a moment some promotional videos that I found on his website that feature, I think, his masterwork. He's written so many. And by the way, I emphasize the fact that he's a historian because he was sued, or he wasn't sued, he was countersued in British courts by an American historian, Deborah Lipstadt. It's a famous academic case, and Lipstadt prevailed. Her forces arrayed against Irving won, so she was able to claim victory over someone that she and her backers refer to as a quote-unquote Holocaust denier. Ooh, that's David Irving. This is why you do not hear his name, David Irving. This is why you must read his books, especially his classic Hitler's War. Let's take a brief look at it. That gives you a dramatic riffling through the pages there of the book. That's the hardback. I think you can get an audio version done through AI in Irving's own AI voice, and you'll also get I'm not promoting it. I don't get any profits or anything, or any promotional consideration here, but I think you also get the e-copy of the book. So the point is, it's easier to obtain now, despite the censorship. Right. This is why today's discussion is important, not just because of Bob Crane's sensational murder and Hogan's Hero and pop and Nazism, but this discussion must be kept alive. It's vital and it's crucial to understanding people like Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's not even his real name. He's part of a larger diaspora himself, which you'll get to before we close here. Right. I'm trying to establish why the popular culture is a portal to these long-standing issues of life and death for many, many people, whether it's in Gaza, Ukraine, or in the United States of America. So here's David Irving himself, the great man. I looked high and low to find anything approaching him speaking to the camera instead of people talking about him being denounced as a Holocaust denier or being interviewed in a way to make him look like a crackpot or to imply that he doesn't have any credentials as a historian. Yes, he's never had an academic post, but many writers never have. However, he does speak fluent German and can read German, having lived in Germany as an ordinary worker for any number of years. Right, so he knows the language, he can read the documents. He doesn't need any translator. He can go right to them. And whether you disagree with his findings or conclusions or not is really secondary to the fact that this person needs to be heard, and he needs to be read, and he needs to be remembered as one of these dissenting voices. Right. He's rising above the Hogan's Heroes and Ira 11 and all the pop Nazis there who are kind of thrown out there to distract us from these persistent issues that have not been resolved in 2025. So here's David Irving.
This book, Hitler's War, is the flagship of my writing career. I'm the only author to have got through to all Adolf Hitler's private staff, his secretaries, the colonels, the adjutants, the field marshals, the generals. For 30 years I tracked them down and interviewed them and persuaded them to give me their private papers, their diaries, their letters, and find out who Adolf Hitler really was. What did he know? Were his orders right? Could he have won World War II if he'd acted differently? Would it have been a good thing or a bad thing? To find out who the real Adolf Hitler was, you're going to have a look at this book, Adolf Hitler, Hitler's War. I wrote it in 1975, and it's been a bestseller ever since.
Yes, a bestseller that you've never heard of because the publishing industry has blacked him out. He's on the blacklist. So check out his website and by the way, you won't find these books in the public library either. You have to go directly to his website if you want to obtain these books. And if you want to go on the retailer that ate the world, Jeff Bezos' firm, you're going to pay hundreds of dollars for the same book. So check it out there. Why is it important? Why are these issues still important? Well, there's another book that I picked up. You can't read it because of the reflection. I'll read it for you. It's titled JFK and RFK's Secret Battle Against Zionist Extremism, the documentary evidence. It's by an author named Ken McCarthy. I don't know much about him. He's written a couple of other books, apparently, which I'm going to read now on the basis of this book. And he's a contributing author, so-called here, by the name of Rick Sterling. This is a fairly recent book. It was published in 2024. And this is what is referred to as a documentary history. That is, he has gone and reprinted all the key documents to support his argument about the connection with the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy to Israeli overseas operations, intelligence operations. And I'll let you figure out the specifics of there. And I mentioned in passing just briefly about Benjamin Netanyahu, who most of you know is the current president of Israel. He's under corruption charges. He seems to be very tight with President Donald J. Trump, uncomfortably tight, right? We have to take a very close look at Donald J. Trump's relationship to matters that have been exposed in the release of documents of JFK, recent ones, and RFK. But this is something that I learned from this book, this documentary history. This is also a recommended reading. I believe I have a link down below that you can use conveniently. I'm reading here. It says Albert Einstein, most of you know who he is. He was a socialist, by the way, but don't hold that against him, all right? Albert Einstein compared revisionist Zionism to Nazi and fascist movements, right? We were talking about the Fourth Reich, right? Albert Einstein himself was using the same rhetoric when talking about what he was seeing going on in Israel. So, continuing reading here, a bit of historical trivia. During this period, Jabotinsky's personal secretary was Benzion Milikowski. His personal secretary. Jacob's, I think Jacob was his given name. Jabotinsky was in some quarters, he's considered to be a terrorist. But according to the extreme Zionist wing of Israeli politics, and there are a lot of anti-Zionists in Israel and in the United States, by the way, who are also Jews, who we don't hear very much about, right? But Jabotinsky was one of the guerrillas who was fighting against the British protectorate right there to prevent the Israeli state from formation. So he's a mean MF, right? Jabotinsky, he's a straight up gangster man, right? And by the way, there's a straight connection between the Jabotinskys and the Meyer-Landskys and the Mensch of the 1930s and 40s and 50s up to the 21st century. All right. Including, what's his name? Harvey, the guy that was controlling Kanye West. Yeah, he has the same family name as, Pasternak, Harley Pasternak. Yeah, okay. The same connection with Blackstone, right? It's a continuous history. That's why this cast here, this current show right here, that's why it's more than about Hogan's Hero. You understand? And I'm just kind of pulling you along through that trail that leads to us to contemporary power politics that could very well lead to World War III, of which my former colleague, Edward Teller, was an advocate of, right, as a physicist, a promoter of the hydrogen bomb. That's Edward Teller. Dr. Strange loved his funky bad self. That's Edward Teller. So let me finish this. There's a bit of historical trivia, right? Jabotinsky's personal secretary, Benzion Milikowski. Milikowski later changed his name to Netanyahu, a name now familiar to everyone. Benzion is the father of Benjamin Netanyahu, who at the time of this writing is Prime Minister of Israel. So you see, his history does not end. It's continuous. It's on an endless loop. It's a loop within a loop. It's flash forward, flash backward. And as we wind down here, let's take a little trip to Latin America, which is a Rockefeller backyard. Right. There was a whole campaign sponsored by the Rockefeller interests and Guggenheim to a lesser extent, interest to make America a friendly, nice, gentle place for American investment. And this is where you start seeing these Hollywood movies about, oh, take a jet down to Rio and Dolores Del Rio and Cuchi Cuchi and Xavier Cugat. And in the 50s, you have a Desi Arnaz orchestra. There was a whole Tropicalia movement starting in the late 40s and 1950s. And of course, they needed Latin America during World War II because the Axis nation, Germany, had made inroads in Latin America with the promise of getting rid of American imperial influence there. And they promised Mexican revolutions. This is going back to the World War I period. They promised their land back, taken from America, if they joined in with Imperial Germany. Right? So that's a whole history that warrants sustained discussion in some other place. I'm just trying to give you the quick and dirty backstory here of how a large population of post-war Germans, I'm not calling them Nazis now, right? German does not mean Nazi. Nazi does not mean German. All right. But how a large community migrated overseas to different parts of Latin America. Argentina seemed to be, there's 4 major German settlements there that we know of. There needs to be a lot more writing about this, right? But let's take a little glimpse. It's already starting to enter into the public awareness. A town in Argentina, which those of you remember the Evita fad of a few years ago. There was a big stage play in Hollywood or in Broadway. It ran for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was called Evita, starring Lily Dupont. There were commercials on it on network television incessantly. I never got to see it, but I did see the movie version of it starring Madonna. She played Evita Perón. It's a pretty nicely done movie, by the way, Madonna notwithstanding. I still remember the theater in San Francisco where I saw it. So it's entered into sort of the pop culture as well through Evita. humanizing them, making the fun little dictator. Where did they get their dictatorial powers and structure, military, all the way down in the civil service? They got it from the expatriate Germans and went there after the war. And technologies, by the way. A lot of these Wunderwaffen, these crazy wonder weapons that are pictured here by this Lafayette book, made their way down to Argentina as well. The Argentinian Air Force is a wonder to behold, thanks to German technology. So Paperclip wasn't just in Huntsville, Alabama. It wasn't just the United States of America. It wasn't just in the Soviet Union. It was also down Latin America. So let's take a look at Argentina. Don't cry for me, Sacramento or Argentina.
Argentina. You may have heard of this nation for its football, its tango, or maybe its beef. But this Southern American country hides many secrets, and I'm about to take you to see one of them.
Between the never-ending flow of beer to the restaurants dedicated to the art of the sausage, to the lush green forests blanketing this town, you might guess that I'm in Germany.
But you're totally wrong. I'm all the way in Argentina. This is Villa General Belgrano. It's a small town nestled in the Sierra Mountains of Córdoba, which is a province right in the center of the country. And even though this town is only home to about 6,000 people, it's known for holding one of the biggest Oktoberfests in the world. Every year, thousands of people come here from around the world to take part in the beer making and wurst traditions that dominate this town.
There are many locals here that continue to maintain German traditions. There's a group that has built a German community center, and they hold special German events using typical traditional German clothing, like Oktoberfest.
Villa General Belgrano is one of the few historically German-speaking villages at Argentina. And while visiting here may seem like all fun and games, this tiny town is home to a dark history that many know little about. It was an escape haven for the Nazis. Some even say that Hitler passed through. Let's go back in history.
When World War II broke out in Europe in 1939, it changed the face of the world, even all the way in the most southern point of Latin America. Here in Argentina, General Juan Domingo Perón was rising to power in the 1940s, bringing along with him fascist-friendly ideas. And even though Argentina appeared to condemn Germany for the atrocities committed during the Holocaust.
Well, that's where we came in with the installation of General Juan Perón, right? Whose tutors were these expatriate, probably Reich members. They were probably high-level Nazi Party members, not the rank and file people who settled the area, right? Now, also, just very briefly, because I'm running out of time, there has also been a historical revisiting of during the post-war period of the German psyche, I guess. And there was a lot of guilt tripping, a lot of historical revisionism taking place. This is not the time to revisit that. That takes months and months of study, years of study, full-time study, and minutes and hours of discussion that I don't have right now. But suffice to say that you had filmmakers who were trying to understand the German, specifically the Nazi past in a very serious but aesthetically conscious way. And one such person, and I'm only mentioning this because I got to see the film in person when it first came out. And it was several hours long. I think it was 6 or 7 hours long. It was a Wagnerian extravaganza. And it was done by a filmmaker, and he's still alive, by the way, by the name of Hans-Jürgen Seiberberg. And he screened the film on the campus of UCLA. And somehow in the pre-internet days, I found out about it and went with a friend of mine. I dragged him along. He wasn't really interested. He was interested in Nazis, but he liked the swords and the regalia and the hats and the uniforms and all that. I was interested in the politics, the history, and the culture. So I said, hey, let's go down to UCLA. And the film was screened in Royce Hall, the famed Royce Hall. And during intermission, because I told you it was hours long film. It's an excellent film. It's available on DVD, by the way. If you want to check it, I recommend it. It's not a conventional film. It's an art film. It's more like as I alluded to earlier, more like a Wagnerian opera, right? But during one of the intermissions, who do we run into outside Royce Hall, relaxing, taking a break? But a famed actor by the name of Walter Matthau. Walter Matthau was there. This is in Los Angeles now. So you can bet there were some people from the movie community who were going to UCLA who wanted to check out this film. So here's Hans Jürgen, just to let you know that the German people have not slipped into historical amnesia. As a society, it seems to me that they're very conscious of it and have taken serious steps in trying to grapple with the meaning of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism, specifically of Nazism. So let's take a quick look at Hans-Jürgen Cyberberg before we conclude. Just a couple seconds here.
Im New Yorker Apartment von Francis Ford Coppola, dem wichtigsten Mann des neuen Hollywood, bespricht Tom Luddy mit Hans-Jürgen Syberberg die letzten Vorbereitungen zur Premiere von Syberbergs 7-Stunden-Film Hitler.
Room 907. It sold out so quickly that there were 300 seats.
Es war so schnell ausverkauft, dass die Leute sogar Karten für die Plätze haben wollten, von denen aus man nur 80% der Leinwand sehen kann.
80% of the screen, and people insisted to buy those tickets, even though they can't see the whole screen. Where are the important people? Which are the best seats? I think down in the central orchestra. But you know, it's funny. This is the same room where
Wissen Sie, das Komische ist, hier lief beim New York Film Festival die Ehe der Maria Braun. Das war der letzte Film, der in diesem Saal gezeigt wurde. Gab es eine Diskussion? Ich weiß nicht.
So this is the run-up to the New York Film Festival. New York City is the film festival capital of the United States. It's not LA, it's New York. You've got serious cinephiles in New York City. The theaters are still there. They've seen better days, but the film culture is still very strong. The cinema schools there, New York University, Columbia, alive and well. And I'm sure at that particular screening, you saw people there in the audience, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, every filmmaker that we hold in reverence was probably sitting in the audience checking out Cyberberg. And probably maybe investing money and making sure that these films are being seen by the American public. But have you heard of Cyberberg yourself? Maybe if you study film or know the film history, perhaps you have. But like David Irving, he's been wiped out of the political, the social, the cultural memory, because his view of the Reich period does not square with the political orthodoxy that's in place today in academia, in government, in the foundations, in media. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that's changing. Perceptions are changing in the larger community, but is within the Jewish American community as well. Look at the work of the journalist Katie Halper if you want just a very small glimpse at that. Or look at Democracy Now! Again, it's a socialist, a leftist outlet. So a lot of you are going to go screaming, oh, it's communist, it's leftist. And you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction. But there's a lot of commonality between these different groups where it comes to the politics is being embodied by this character named, and I say character because he's a scripted character, right? His name's Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump's friend, right? Remember that while we're celebrating the release of the documents of JFK and RFK, who, according to this author and many more that are starting to come out of the woodwork now, or at least they're being given a forum to talk about, are really not down anymore with the contemporary Israel, U.S. political brotherhood that's taking us down with them if they exercise what they refer to as the Samson option. That's a book that was written by now an American expatriate. I think he lives in London. And it's from the biblical story of Samson, where he brought the temple upon him. He killed himself, and so that his spirit and his message could live on. That's the nuclear Samson option. That's their name for it. All right. So if you think that's too far removed in the past, and that's Germany, you don't have to really worry about it. I found out as we wrap up here that one of the scholars that I had admired, and I still respect a lot of her work here. She happened to teach at Columbia University, I think in the sociology department, but she's one of the theorists of globalism. And she crafted this idea of the global city. So she studied such monumental constructions as Tokyo or New York, maybe Paris or Berlin, but you get the idea. These world cities, these cosmopolitan cities where all sorts of heterodox ideas, cultures, cuisines, and languages come together. This is the world cities. So she's theorized this in this stage of late capitalism. She's anti-capitalism. Remember, the Nazis were also anti-capitalism. The name of their party was National Socialism. Right? So they were social. And by the way, Israel was founded on socialist principles itself. Right? So don't get your knickers in a twist when you hear socialism or Frankfurt School or, oh, she's a commie, right? Forget the little terminologies that the right likes to use. And I think that that's part of the psyops as well. So you're not going to really look into what they have to say. But I found out that this particular scholar at Columbia University, her name's Saskia Sassen, was the daughter of a Dutch Nazi. He was and his brother were full-fledged parties of the Nazi Party in the Netherlands. And they were collaborating with the Nazi takeover during the World War II period and after the war. And they were also part of this diaspora that went down to Latin America. Furthermore, Saskia Sassen never disclosed this part of her family's dark Nazi past to any of her colleagues. So people like me were just taking her for this person who had a certain vision of the post-capitalist world of these global cities, right? I think she was thinking about what we know today as the 15-minute city. In retrospect, now I think she was coming from a Fourth Reich perspective of these large enclaves of humanity that are tightly controlled and monitored. A la true globalism. That's the Fourth Reich. This is Klaus Schwab all over again. No, I might be overstating the fact. I have to read more for work now. But the fact that she withheld this information leads to my darkest suspicions. I can't remember exactly who uncovered it, but she did not come forth voluntarily with that information. I think it was a journalist that started to do some detective work. And there was a book published, it's called Hidden Nazis. Of course, I have a copy of it. Of course, it's now out of print, just like the David Irving books. And of course, now it goes for a couple $100. So the moral of that story is if I recommend a book here and it's kind of weird, like a Maximilian Lafayette about the Third Reich down in Argentina, you might want to buy that book because it could be worth a lot of dollars when copies are bought up and destroyed and pulped, or the authors are either character assassinated or done away with physically. Hidden Nazis. I'm trying to find my copy. I have it in storage someplace, but I can show you proof. I have Amazon. It shows the date when I purchased the book. I checked it out before preparing here to see how much it was going for. And true to my suspicions, it's no longer in print. It's going for a lot of money. It's called Hidden Nazis. So if you want to look at that, I also looked in TubeView to see if there's any interviews about that. It's been scrubbed. There's no information that I can find. So you're going to have to do with my memory here, my recollection of that book. And she does talk, I'm talking about Saskia Sassen, talk about as a child, overhearing conversations that her brother, or her father and uncle would have to visiting quote unquote ex-Nazi dignitaries to their little town. And I didn't even state this because a lot of you know already that there's a large amount of evidence saying that Hitler himself and his mistress Eva Braun, or he got married, Eva Braun escaped to Argentina, along with other, about Josef Mengele, and it's been popularized in these films like Boys from Brazil and whatnot, right? But in addition to that, there were people like the Sassen brothers who reconstituted, at least in their mind, with maybe a future scenario or revival in mind, right? That's why I say there's anxiety around the fear of a Fourth Reich, because there's so many historical markers and examples where that fear is justified. And we don't even have to go down to Latin America, South America. We can look right here in the United States of America, right? As it turns out, a lot of these John Birchers, quote unquote John Birchers, they was right. It took me a long while to get around to that literature, because when I was growing up, we were taught that they were raving anti-communist lunatics who thought there was a communist under every bed. But you know what? Their thought and their thinking was a lot more subtle and sophisticated than what we were taught. So if I can make a suggestion, start reading that literature. You don't have to become a neo-Nazi or neo-fascist. You need to read it at minimum for historical reference. So here's a glimpse at a one generation removed from Nazi who's teaching at an American elite university, Columbia, Professor Saskia Sassen, who kept this information secret. What other dark secrets are being withheld from the American public? I ask you.
I met Saskia at her home in New York City. She is a sociology professor at New York's prestigious Columbia University.
I know you've talked a lot about this, but I still see it as a really good launching point. Born in the Netherlands, grew up in Argentina, later Italy, studied in France. We're sitting here in New York. You talk about global cities, but you're a global citizen. Do you think that's the reason why you have such a fascination with it?
Probably. But I wonder if I would just be stuck in one particular space, whether I would not also begin to fantasize about all those other worlds. So just because one travels, I don't think is enough to explain why you would be engaged by all the different spaces. And so, who knows?
What has the pandemic taught us about globalization, do you think?
That's interesting. Well, I think, number one, we had it coming. Immigration, after all, it's serious stuff. And people all over the world are being expelled from what they thought was their land, their homeland. And so we see them as people who invade us, perhaps. Well, but who knows what firms in the Americas produced their departure from whatever other country where some big American firm or German firm, whatever, has actually, grabbed a lot of land. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Okay, we understand her leftist perspective. It's American transnational capitalism that displaced the compañeros or the peasantry from the land. We understand capitalism and how, and it's not something that anybody here, myself, approves of. But what she's missing is that what are the origins of this mystery disease, right? It's recently been, once more, the receipts have been produced that this was a product of the national security state, the United States of America. So you can talk all you want about these grandiose notions of global cities, right? But if you don't talk about the totalitarian innards or infrastructure that animates this discussion, then we're going in circles, and it's even more dangerous listening to these stories by Professor Sasson about these castles in the sky, these magic mountains, these global cities. She happens to live probably in a Columbia University owned apartment building with a doorman in New York City, uptown, right? I know the area well. I lived down in the village in an apartment with a doorman owned by New York University. So we were sheltered from the public squalor that she's complaining about, in theory, right? Anyway, getting back to the larger point, this fear of a Fourth Reich, the Fourth Reich anxiety combined with the pop Nazism is both an anxiety, but there's also, I didn't get to talk about this, but there's a certain envy about an ideal living state of the global city, as Sasson is theorizing it, that's of course controlled by all the marvelous technologies, right? I'd like to see what she's, and I haven't been there, but I'd like to see what she has to say, Professor Sasson has to say about places like Dubai, or even Singapore, which I have been to. And it's a technological utopia, but it's very scary. Right? Is that where we're heading? If so, then the concept of the Fourth Reich needs to be revisited. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a happy holiday, a happy Easter more specifically, and God willing, I'll be back with you next Sunday. Thank you for putting up with me. Put a share and a like on this. Join the subscription. I want to get to that 50,000 mark. There was a 60,000. I'm being suppressed here, right? I want to have more subscriptions so I can get guests on the show. Say, what? You only have 50,000 subscribers. Why should I come to your little puny show? I want to get Maximilian Lafayette on the show. So yes, I have 100,000 subscribers, and you can also join my Patreon for some other information, juicy PDFs and secret shared information, intelligence that my Patreons. And thank you very much for supporting me, my fellow Patreons. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next Sunday. God willing. Peace.